So I recently bought the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection on the Nintendo Switch. It really wasn't very expensive, and it had a number of classic Street Fighter games from the very first Street Fighter all the way through to the Street Fighter 2 series, Alpha, and then Street Fighter 3. And so I wanted to do a video here on World of Geekdom and discuss kind of my Street Fighter memories because I was a kid when Street Fighter 2 ruled the earth, and Street Fighter at one point ruled the earth, and in some ways it still does. I mean, Dragon Ball Fighters was, record breaking at Evo, but Street Fighter is kind of what built Evo. You see what I'm saying? And if you're a longtime fan of Street Fighter, if you're in my age group, which is early 30s, you know kind of what we had to go through back in the day when it came to Street Fighter. So, my first exposure to Street Fighter 2 is, and again, this is Street Fighter memories. So, when I was a little kid, I lived in this apartment complex, and right next door there was a store. Right next door there was a store, a convenience store that was run by Indians. And I know it seems like a stereotype, with Apu and The Simpsons, but no, it was actually run by Indian people. And I liked them; they were pretty cool. But I remember they changed ownership after a while. And, I don't know if it was the same family. I never really figured that out. But they were always nice to me. And they had arcade machines there. And they had two of them. And I remember being a kid. I want to say I was 7 or 8. I don't remember exactly how old I was. But they had two arcade machines there. They had Art of Fighting and they had Street Fighter 2. Now, when it came to Art of Fighting, that's an SNK, old school game. Maybe I'll do a video about old SNK games. But Street Fighter, I saw it. I didn't really do much. It looked cool. And as a kid, I had played Final Fight first. Okay, I played Final Fight. And I'm pretty sure that Mike Matei from Cinemassacre said something similar to me. I think it was him or James Rolfe recently in a video where they talked about how when they first saw Street Fighter, it was like, well, you're only fighting one guy and not like 3 or 4 guys, so why do I care? Like, that was kind of my first reaction. Like, yeah, it looks cool, but so what is it? Like, it's basically like a bunch of boss fights, and that's kind of sort of what it was. Like, if you're used to playing side-scrolling beat-em-up games like Final Fight, the TMNT game, you fight a boss at the end, right? And, of course, Final Fight was a Capcom game. This game was like you fight one other person, then you fight the next one, It's like, okay, so they're basically boss fights, but more technical. That's how I had first seen it. Then what happened was one of my close friends, or my best friend when I was a kid, who I haven't seen in years. I mean, I haven't seen this guy in, God, it has to be over 20 years. I mean, I found him on social media once, but that was a long time ago. Anyways, so this dude would come over and tell me about Street Fighter 2 being on Super Nintendo. So I went out and I had my parents buy me Street Fighter 2 on SNES. And there was just something about this game. Like, it was, it's a classic. I mean, really, it's not the best in the series. They improved it as time went on, but it's a classic. Like, you had Ryu and Ken, who we all called Ryu, and the Hadoken, which we all called Hadokus because we didn't know any better, until we got the little manual that came with the Street Fighter book, which is kind of funny because in the manual, they refer to the Hurricane Kick as Tatsumaki Senpu Kyaku, but when you hear them do the move, it sounds like he's saying Futaitai Dogen. I never understood that. It didn't match up. I didn't hear Tatsumaki Senpu Kyaku at all. But whatever. And so I'm playing this game, and you have these awesome characters. And one thing about Street Fighter is that it's got some of the best character design of any game ever. And that's why I think it works, because every character is unique. You had Ryu and Ken. You had Blanca, big green monster with orange hair. You had Chun-Li, the token girl that every game had to have one. You had Dalsim, who I never really liked that much, but he was cool with the stretchy body and all that. You had Zangief, which is an up-close fighter. Again, never liked him too much. Later on, I discovered how great he was. E Honda, big dude, the 1,000 palm strike move. I forget what the actual name was. Then you have like Guile, who is the tough military guy. Always very powerful, Guile was. I used to play with him. And, the thing about these games back then, and again, I don't know if this is how it is nowadays for kids, because I feel like nowadays there are so many more distractions. Back in the day, I grew up poor, so I didn't have like a million games. So I would replay the crap out of Street Fighter on the hardest difficulty. And I remember, my goal was to master those original 8 characters, and all they had was 8 characters. So I would play with everyone, Honda, Blanca. Nowadays, I seem to stick more so with like Ryu and Ken. I keep it pretty simple nowadays, but back in those days, I just wanted to get good with everyone. And I got good with pretty much everyone except for Zangief and Dalsim. They were the weakest links to me. I mean, that's how I was when I was a kid. But it was so cool because, you fight through your way through the other 7 opponents. Then you go to the boss fights, which was, Balrog, Vega, Sagat, who we all called Sagat back then because we didn't know any better, and M. Bison. Of course, in the original Japanese version, Bison was Vega and Balrog was Mike Bison, like Mike Tyson, and Vega was Balrog. Everybody who knows about Street Fighter knows this. We didn't back then. But I just remember wanting to get all 8 endings and seeing how cool it was, how you beat the game and you got like Ryu's ending, Chun-Li's ending, Guile's ending. And I used to love like opening up the manual and like reading the stories. Because one thing that I miss about games, some games do still do this, is the original booklet would tell you all kinds of like cool backstories. Like they told you like how Guile was looking for Charlie, who wound up like, crashing a plane. They didn't know what was going on. You've got the whole Shadaloo thing. I remember the big kind of speculation as a kid was about Bison, and they were basically saying that Bison was a drug dealer. And the reason why the kids at school would say that is because, when you play the arcade game, it's got like a do not do drugs like thing. And actually, to this day, I never really saw him as a drug dealer. Bison's more of like a terrorist, you know what I'm saying? But it was kind of part of the lore back then, playing Street Fighter 2. But so I played the home version. I played the crap out of it. Street Fighter 2 is a legitimate classic game. The World Warrior. And one of the cool things about the game was kind of trying to figure out what was, the secrets. Like, for example, there was a trick where you could actually do Ryu versus Ryu and Ken versus Ken if you have 2 controllers, which back then was, you could not do that. See, it's hard to explain this to the kids nowadays who grew up on the modern games, because in the original Street Fighter 2, you couldn't do like Ryu versus Ryu. You couldn't do mixed matchups. They didn't introduce that until Champion Edition. You had to trick the computer, right? You had to. I'm not gonna get into how you do it, but you had to basically trick the computer. Otherwise, you couldn't even have a versus fight with the same person. The game wouldn't let you do it. And as the game evolved with its sequels, you got the ability to do it. Now, the thing about Street Fighter is, I'm telling you, me and my friends would play the crap out of this game. We try to beat M. Bison at the highest difficulty. I think it was 8 stars or 10 stars or whatever. And it was just a trip, dude. Like, it was a trip trying to do that. And the thing that's interesting is I played the Super Nintendo version, the SNES version, and it's funny because, that version was so smooth on the SNES, which is still a legendary system. And yet, when I went to the arcades, the arcades had like the real version, and you could see like the differences in the graphics. Like the arcade one was so much better. I mean, nowadays with the home consoles, I think really starting with the PS2, you had these like tremendously perfect home ports. Obviously, you had PC versions too, but I'm talking about consoles. Back then they had to take stuff out. And it wasn't the same. Now, many of you are probably wondering, what about Street Fighter 1? I actually never played Street Fighter 1, and actually most of the kids back then didn't for years. The only way to play Street Fighter 1 is if you had an arcade that had it, which, again, not many arcades. In fact, I don't know any in the Tampa Bay area that had Street Fighter 1. That being said, I'm sure there was one out there back then. I never saw it. I never saw Street Fighter 1. The only way to play Street Fighter 1 is if you had a TurboGrafx 16 system, which I did not have, and if you played a game called Fighting Street. Fighting Street was Street Fighter 1. And I did end up playing Street Fighter 1 many years later in a bowling alley, right? They had like a Capcom system. It was one of those like multi-game cabinets, and I got to play Street Fighter 1 there, and it's pretty damn... Street Fighter 1 is really primitive, dude. One thing that's kind of cool about it is if you hit your super moves, whether it be the Hadouken or the Shoryuken, Dragon Punch, or the Hurricane Kick, usually the Dragon Punch, you can do a one-hit knockout. If you do it just right, you can Dragon Punch someone and do a one-hit knockout. Hadouken will take away like almost the entire life bar. Special moves back then were punishing. So I remember that same friend came over and told me about Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition. Now, obviously, it was just called Champion Edition, and he's like, oh, well, now you can play as the bosses that you couldn't play as before, and that was a huge deal. Plus, they made some tweaks to the game, too. They gave everybody an alternate costume, so you can do the versus battles. I think Champion Edition was the first game to have Ryu and Ken do the blue Hadouken, but that might have been Turbo. But no, like Champion Edition was a pretty big freaking deal, and it never got a home release. Instead, what happened was on Super Nintendo they released Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which in the arcades was called Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting. What I found interesting looking into this years later was that when it came to like Turbo, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, like if you had like a Champion Edition cabinet, like the arcade cabinet, Capcom could send you an upgrade to the cabinet. You didn't have to buy a whole new machine. I read that somewhere online. I was like, that's kind of cool. Like that's like an early era kind of upgrading hardware type thing, you know, which we all do with PCs now. That was kind of a cool concept. So when you go to the arcades, you'll often see a machine that says Turbo Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition Hyper Fighting. And I was like, man, that's a long name. But that was the name of the game. Like, that was the name of the game. And it's just interesting because, you know, I don't have to tell you how legendary Street Fighter 2 is or its sequels. I really don't have to tell you because any historian of gaming knows, you know, that this was like the godfather of fighting games. I mean, it wasn't the first one, but it was definitely one that was the evolution of modern gaming. I mean, hell, combo started in Street Fighter 2, obviously by accident, as we were come to find out years later. And so basically, Turbo came out, and Turbo was faster. In some ways, too fast. And you could actually do a code, I think, in the SNES version. There was a code. Down, R, up, L, Y, B. I remember the damn code. Jesus, bro. 30 years. Well, it wasn't 30 years. It was like 25 years. Like, oh, God, I can't really remember the code. So, down, R, up, L, Y, B. And you get the super fast, you know, speed. I remember they released on the Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive, a game called Special Champion Edition, which was kind of cool. I never bought it. I had a friend of mine who owned this game. It was cool. It was pretty much, like Hyper Fighting, except on Genesis. I thought the Genesis version was a little bit choppy, to be honest with you. And one thing that really sucked is that the Genesis controller had 3 buttons. You had to buy a 6-button controller, or you had to alternate with 1 button, and that's horrible. You just can't pull off combos the same way like that. Just doesn't really work, dude. But I mean, if you had a Sega, that was your only Street Fighter game. You know, Super Nintendo had 3 of them. We're gonna get to the next one here in a minute. So then, and by the way, during this time period, I was deeply into the magazines, very much into gaming magazines, and I saw the promotion for Super Street Fighter 2. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I'm a kid. I'm thinking, well, where the hell is Street Fighter 3? We've got Street Fighter 2. We've got Champion Edition. We've got Turbo. All right, I get it. You're doing updates. Like, nowadays, this would be like a DLC pack. No, like back then, it was a whole new game you had to buy or go play in the arcades. With Super, you know, it was called, I think, the New Challengers. Yeah, Super Street Fighter 2, the New Challengers. And that game introduced 4 more characters. So you already had the bosses. Then you got, I think it was a DJ, T-Hawk, Fei Long, and Cammy. Now, I loved where the series was going, and I loved the new characters. I loved DJ, and DJ, I think, was an American-made character. I don't think that was a Japanese Capcom Japan character. But I loved how, you know, they also added the Flaming Shoryuken. That was cool. That was very cool. And also, Fei Long had, like, the Shoryuken with his leg. Dude, like, and those fast-ass freaking hand combos. He was supposed to be Bruce Lee. And then T-Hawk was kind of a slow character, but, man, whenever you played T-Hawk against the computer, he was always a cheap ass. He was a bastard. But Super Street Fighter 2 also slowed the game down. You know, in comparison to Turbo. Like, Turbo was fast. Super was not as fast. I like the new characters, but what the hell? And that was interesting. Now, that being said, one of the things that I found cool was, and this is something that not a lot of people talk about, but Super Street Fighter 2 was the first game to actually have this tournament edition called the Tournament Battle, where if you, and this is crazy. This was crazy back then. Remember, this is early. Like, nowadays, computers can do this no problem, and so can arcade machines. Back in the day, this was like a revolutionary thing. You could have, if you have 4 arcade cabinets of Super Street Fighter 2, you could put all 4 next to each other and then hook them up with some kind of like cable in the back. I never did it myself. and create your own little tournament. 2 players on each arcade machine. This was crazy. This was crazy. Like, you could do that back then. I don't know anybody who ever actually did it outside of, like, California. You know what I mean? That was like a West Coast thing. But they later on released Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. I saw the magazine ad for it, and I just, in my head, the first thing I thought was, okay, now you're milking it. Like, it actually felt they were milking it. And then it got kind of funny because I was expecting the next game to be Street Fighter 3, and then they released Street Fighter Alpha, and I'm like, come on, dude. Like, where the hell is Street Fighter 3? And it wouldn't come out for another, I think 4 years. But, so Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, right? This was, again, another update. It's the 5th Street Fighter 2 game. I only played it once in the arcade. Once. Later on, I would play it a bunch of times. Like, there's a crap load of home console releases of this game. Like, there's so many different versions of this game, and it is included in that Switch pack. So the only home console back then, before the PlayStation era, because PlayStation and Sega Saturn did have versions of this game, and it did come out on Dreamcast, PS3, the Turbo HD remix. The only home console that had it was a system called the Panasonic 3DO. And I've only seen one of these in my entire life. See, back in the day, they would have these consoles that try to compete with Nintendo and Sony. I'm sorry, Nintendo and Sega, and nobody would buy them because nobody played them. Now, they didn't have any third-party support. Now, it's funny because, as Evolution would tell us, Sony came in, and later Microsoft, and now the big three is Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony as far as console wars go. But for a while, Sega was in the hunt, and then they dropped out when the PS2 destroyed the Dreamcast. I remember vividly when that happened. But nobody had 3DO. I couldn't play this game. But I did play it later on, and it was interesting because this game also introduced, like, actual air combos. They were in the game before, but they gave you, like, it actually was acknowledged in this game, and it also introduced Akuma, who's pretty much one of the most popular characters in Street Fighter history. And you had to, if I remember correctly, it's been so many years, you had to defeat Bison, I think, 2 straight rounds or something like that, or get, like, I forget the actual way to get Akuma. I'm sorry, I don't remember. It's been so many years. And if you do it correctly, Akuma will come into the screen, you fight him. And I remember the big rumor back then was that Akuma was like the brother of Shenlong, who is the trainer for Ryu. And I remember, when you defeat somebody with Ryu, he'll say, you must defeat Shenlong to stand a chance. So everybody back then assumed that Shenlong was Ryu and Ken's master, the real alpha dog of the Hado martial arts style, right? And I remember there were magazine hoaxes. EGM did an April Fool's prank where they had a way to unlock Shenlong, and this was like a recurring thing they would do every year with these April Fool's pranks. I love them to death. But it was just funny because, he was the coolest guy, like with the black gi, and he later on would become playable, but the playable version of Akuma was nowhere near as cool as the arcade boss that would kick your ass. And I remember he used to show up. Like, that air Hadouken combo where he throws a bunch of Hadoukens at you from the sky was, like, completely nuts. And this was also the first game to introduce the super combos, the super moves, the super Hadouken, whatever the moves were. They had this tiny little bar in the lower left, and, you could, you fill it up, which was not easy, by the way. Later on in different games that would come out later, you could fill it up easier, but in this one, it just wasn't the same thing. And when you filled it up, if you hit like a double quarter circle forward or whatever the combination was, you could hit the super move. And that was kind of cool. But by this time, I had started to check out because I kind of got sick and tired of the Street Fighter 2, clones. I did play Alpha, and I love Alpha. I love Alpha 2 and Alpha 3 are some of my favorite Street Fighter games of all time. I think Street Fighter Alpha 3 might be my favorite, the PS1 port. And then finally Street Fighter 3 came out, which I'll cover in a different video probably, but there's no need. I mean, when it comes to Street Fighter 2, like, this was like the definitive fighting game. Like, pretty much every fighting game that comes out that's similar to this one, a 2D fighting game, will always get compared to this one or one of its successors every time. Arc System Works, makes great stuff. SNK, Capcom kind of really nailed it way back in the day with the original Street Fighter 2. And I have so many memories of me and my friends literally staying up late playing it, trying to unlock like secrets, trying to figure out like, hearing rumors of things that weren't true, which is something that kids did back then. Maybe I'll do a whole video about that. But, I have such fond memories. And the thing that's interesting about the whole thing is, when I first saw Goku do the Kamehameha, I thought he was copying Ryu. And that wasn't the case at all. But I thought so back then. That was my first exposure to, when I saw Goku do it, I was like, hey, that looks like a Hadouken. Must be a Japanese thing. Because I knew Dragon Ball was Japanese, like, from the beginning. I wasn't one of those kids that was, oh, wait, it's Japanese? I thought it was an English show. No, I knew. And I knew Street Fighter was Japanese, too. I just knew, like, you just know that the Japanese create these games, and even to this day, they make, like, the best games, right? Really. I mean, Rockstar, there's other companies, but I mean, back then, Japan just non-stop classics, and obviously not every game's a classic, but, definitely Capcom, for sure, was a beast back then. So those are my memories of Street Fighter 2, the World Warrior and its sequels. Again, fond memories of those games. When I picked them up now on the Switch, though, they're kind of hard to play. Like Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition are kind of tough for me to play, and Super. Turbo I can play because it's fast, and Super Turbo I can play, but the other ones are just, I wind up getting bored. I hate saying that. I really do hate saying it, but I do wind up getting a little bit bored because they're so slow, and you just kind of want to move on to something quicker. So and I end up popping in like Street Fighter 3, Third Strike, or Alpha 2 or Alpha 3, because the Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and Super just don't, even Turbo in some cases, just they don't hold up. They really don't hold up. In my opinion, I think that they really perfected their craft, with the Alpha games and then on to Street Fighter 3. So that's my opinion. Thanks for listening. And if you remember the era of Street Fighter, leave a comment. Let me know some of your memories, and I'll see y'all soon.